In today's video, I'm going to give you guys a very in-depth look at my testing of the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max. And let me tell you, working on this video was chaotic. I've got in-depth battery comparisons, photo tests, dynamic island questions and concerns, and most importantly, and alarmingly, one of my iPhone 14 Pro Maxes was dead on arrival. That is fantastic. All of that and much more to come, so get subscribed, leave a like down below, and let's get into it. Today's video is sponsored by Rhino Shield. Rhino Shield's MagSafe compatible iPhone 14 cases are now out with built-in magnets that are up to 2 times stronger than Apple's for a seamless wireless charging experience. With 5 new colors, cobalt blue, ash gray, antique bronze, violet, and sage green, their cases are thoughtfully designed to perfectly complement the new iPhone colors. Cases also feature different colored buttons and camera rings you can switch out, as well as hundreds of print options for you to truly customize your phone. Rhino Shield cases offer stronger than military grade protection, and they're made from a food grade BPA-free plastic, and they ship in biodegradable packaging. You can further accessorize your new or old iPhone with their Grip Mini or Grip Max, depending on your preference. These are adjustable grips that attach to the back of your device with adhesive or MagSafe options and slide open for a comfortable phone grip. Made from 85% recycled materials, Rhino Shield grip can withstand over 200,000 usage tests and give you the perfect grip and style. To learn more about Rhino Shield and add some extra flair and protection to your iPhone, check out the link in the description below and use code LukeMiani for 20% off within the first week. And now let's get back to the video. It's hard really to know where to start with my iPhone 14 Pro review, considering that over the last 24 hours, I have spent quite a bit of time dealing with this.
What?
Yeah, so don't worry. A lot of context on that is to come, but let's try to keep things somewhat normal, and we're going to start off by talking about the iPhone 14 Pro's big feature, the dynamic island. I don't really know what I expected from the dynamic island, but I was both very happy and slightly disappointed. I was delighted to find all of the many different situations that cause some fun animations up at the top of your screen, including turning on or off your ringer, getting a FaceTime call, navigation directions, whether you're driving or walking, and my personal favorite, the album art that shows up there when you're playing music. However, there are a number of areas where the dynamic island was disappointing or confusing. First of all, notifications. They show up just like before as banners that pop down from, well, nowhere really. I personally was expecting that notifications would bubble out from the dynamic island, but they're basically the same as before. Also, I mentioned before how using the dynamic island for navigation is an amazing feature. Well, that's unless you want to use it for transit. If you start transit directions, the only information that you see in the dynamic island is a train icon. It doesn't give you any information, it doesn't tell you where to go, it's just a train. And that's not ideal because a lot of transit instructions on Apple Maps are telling you how to walk to the station that you're catching a train at. And it's not like this was a complete afterthought, because when you get to the metro station and scan your Apple Wallet Metro card like we have here in Washington, D.C., there's this really cool animation which shows you the card and your remaining balance. And then there's the matter of the Now Playing API. This works across Apple Music or Spotify or wherever. However, if you pause your music there and then go back to what you were doing, after 3 or 4 seconds, the album artwork will disappear and you can no longer pop it out and start your music again. You have to go into Control Center. So it's very confusing that the dynamic island means you don't have to go to Control Center if your music is playing, but if your music is paused, you do have to go to Control Center. I don't like that. And there's other software bugs, like when you get a FaceTime call, it comes out of the dynamic island. Great. But if you hit the green accept button, it just pulls you into the normal FaceTime screen where you then have to again accept the call. So those are all software issues that will hopefully be fixed. But for now, the dynamic island is a little bit weird. And even when it's not a software problem, the fact that it does take up a little bit more space than the notch means if you're watching 2:1 content on YouTube, you'll notice a little bite taken out of it. That's less than optimal. So next up, we got to talk about another one of this year's big features, the always-on display. And I have mixed thoughts on this. So here's your normal lock screen, and here is the always-on display. You can see it's basically just a slightly dimmer version of your normal wallpaper. And so it's a little confusing actually, because at first glance, you just think, oh, my phone's on and dim, but nope. That's what it looks like. Now, there are some scenarios where the always-on display will in fact not always be on. Number one, of course, is if you put it face down or in your pocket. It uses the sensors like when you hold your phone up to your ear and it'll turn the screen off. Another scenario where I found it will eventually turn the screen off is if it is completely pitch black. But if there's light on and you leave this thing out, it will stay on forever. And that does make you wonder, does that have an impact on battery life? So to find out, I actually ran a little bit of an experiment. You see, I have two iPhone 14 Pros, thanks to Donglebook Pro, whose channel I linked down below. He's helping me out with this review. So our experiment was pretty simple. We put two phones side by side with a light on. One had always on display turned on, and one had it off, and we left them overnight for nearly 10 hours. Now, before I tell you exactly what the percentages were, leave a comment down below. I'm curious to hear what you guess it would be. Okay, have you written it? You're probably wrong. The iPhone 14 Pro with always on display turned off went down to 95% battery. With always on display turned on, that phone went to 92. Now, there is a caveat to this test, which is that one phone, my phone, was signed in. So there were background apps that were refreshing. The other phone didn't really have anything on it. With some further testing, we actually found that leaving the AOD on phone overnight for 12 hours drained about 14% of the battery, but turning it off on the same phone with no background app refresh, the battery didn't go down at all. So especially on the smaller battery in the 14 Pro, AOD is going to cost you a couple of percent if you have it on constantly. But even though battery life isn't a super huge concern for me with the always on display, I'm still not a huge fan of it. I don't think it's that useful. I mean, you can't see some of the information in your widgets. Like for example, the activity rings, they don't show up until you unlock it with Face ID, so they're just grayed out. You can see your notifications, and there are some use cases where I could imagine having things available to you at a glance would be nice. For example, you're sitting at your desk and you have it on a wireless stand that's facing you, or you're going for a bike ride and you want to be able to see your directions and notifications and the time without having to wake your phone. However, I have found that using the phone normally, the always-on display does tend to get a little bit irritating. The biggest issue I've had is in the day-to-day activity of pulling your phone out of your pocket, the display sometimes seems to get confused. So I'll pull it out, unlock the phone, and be on the home screen before it actually brightens the display all the way. It's a little bit clunky right now, and it's gonna need some software to get it working properly. Okay, so now we gotta talk about the cameras, because that was probably a bigger feature than the always-on display, and it allows me to introduce the, shall we say, pretty bad manufacturing defect that Donglebook Pro and I discovered in one of the Pro Maxes that we've been testing. So in the process of going through the cameras to test Pro RAW, the new and improved macro mode, ultra wide camera, action mode, all of that stuff, this happened. What? Are you kidding me? Wait, can we actually see it shaking? Yeah, you can see it moving. The primary 48 megapixel lens on Dongle's Pro Max just completely freaked out. It seems like the optical image stabilization just completely broke, and in many applications such as Snapchat, Instagram, and even TikTok, people have noticed that the camera just freaks the heck out. I posted about this on Twitter, and a surprising amount of people said that they've experienced this on their 14 Pros and Pro Maxes as well, and we were even able to find a TikTok of someone experiencing the exact same issue.
Do not update your iPhone 14.
So that is really bad. The phone was about 5 hours old, and I know that there have been issues where the optically stabilized iPhone cameras have freaked out when exposed to extreme vibrations, such as going on a motorcycle. That did not happen to us. This phone was brand new out of the box, and it just randomly started freaking out. And worst of all, we started to notice damage to the actual camera itself. It became very difficult for it to focus, and eventually just wouldn't focus on things that are close, even in the stock camera app. Now, we were able to get this issue at least hopefully resolved by going back to the Apple Store from which we picked it up and exchanging the phone for a new one, so that was very nice of them. However, those are things that you'd be able to do on your first day of ownership, but if that happens a year and 2 months down the line and you don't have Apple Care, that could be a problem. So if you do have that issue, go back to the Apple Store and demand an exchange immediately. Now, all that out of the way, when we actually did get to test the cameras, they're freaking awesome. One of the things that I was most excited to test out this year is 48 megapixel Pro RAW photos, and honestly, I was not disappointed. The amount of clarity, resolution, and detail in these images is really genuinely very impressive. I also noticed some definite improvements in the ultra-wide sensor. So if you look at them side by side with a 13 Pro Max on the right and a 14 Pro Max on the left, you can really see in the edges of the photo that there's a lot less detail being lost, there's a lot less grain. The photos just look a lot more robust. So this is great to see. Obviously, since the ultra-wide camera came out back on the iPhone 11 series, it was a little bit lesser in quality, but now Apple has finally breathed some really good life into it. Another feature that goes a long way is the new action mode. I haven't had a chance to test this with a ton of depth, but the few little test shots that I did were genuinely really impressive. I could definitely see a lot of people using these in place of GoPros. Amazing. But one thing that continues to bother me is the default camera app's insistence on switching lenses all the time. This isn't new with the iPhone 14 series, it did that on the 13 as well. However, this time it's really bothersome because if you're trying to shoot macro shots, you either get photos like this with the 48 megapixel sensor that are just absolutely stunning. I could look at that all day. But sometimes it just decides, you know what? I'm gonna use the ultra wide camera for this. And then you get photos like this. God, that's awful. What even is that? Why would it possibly switch to using that cropped in garbage? And sure, yeah, you can fix all of that by downloading a third-party camera app that gives you more control, but sometimes you just want to snap a quick picture with the camera button on the lock screen, and it makes it really irritating when that camera just doesn't do what you want it to do. So for the final part of this video, I want to talk about batteries. because the battery life on the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max hasn't really been talked about by Apple all that much. So here's the testing layout. I got an iPhone 14 Pro Max, an iPhone 13 Pro Max, and an iPhone 12 Pro Max, and we set them all side by side and did 30 minutes of browsing on TikTok, 30 minutes browsing Instagram, 30 minutes on Twitter, 30 minutes on Reddit, then 30 minutes on TikTok again, followed up by 30 minutes of 4K YouTube. All of this was done at 80% brightness across the board. All of the phones were on cellular, which is important because a lot of the time your phone is going to be on cellular. Of course, all of the iPhones are on the same version of iOS, and the interesting curveball here is that the iPhone 12 and 13 Pro Maxes that we used are basically brand new. They have 100% battery health. As we got started here, the iPhone 14 Pro Max was going really strong. After the first 30 minutes on TikTok, we were at 100% versus 97 and 93 on the older models. By an hour in, it was starting to even out a little bit. The iPhone 14 came down to 94, the 13 at 92, and the 12 Pro Max, well, that guy was down at 85. However, by the time we got to the Reddit portion of the test, the iPhone 13 Pro Max and 14 Pro Max were dead even. And by the time that test was done, the iPhone 13 Pro Max was ahead. It was 85, 87, 77. And by the time our full 3-hour suite had run, the iPhone 14 Pro Max was at 70%. The 13 Pro Max was at 77%, and the 12 Pro Max at 62%. That was not what I expected. A 7% difference in the iPhone 13 and 14 in the wrong direction is probably not what Apple wanted to see here. So to give it another chance, we decided to conduct a longer test. We put on a 10-hour YouTube video and let them run overnight on full brightness with audio completely off and over Wi-Fi. And during this test, well, it was a little weird. The 14 Pro Max and the 13 Pro Max were completely tied at 33% after 10 hours. The 12 Pro Max, well, that guy was at 6%. Yeah, the iPhone 12 series was well known for not having the best battery life, and this test absolutely proved that. In both cases, it was by far the lowest. But it definitely took me by surprise that during our manual usage test over cellular, we noticed the 14 Pro Max wasn't able to keep up with last year's iPhone. That's a little bit odd. The iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max. By all accounts, these should have been very boring phones. It's the third year of this design generation, the new color isn't even that interesting, and it should have been completely under the radar. But Apple gave these phones just enough really interesting features to make the hype this year very real. But the problem is, each of those features has its drawbacks. We found that the dynamic island isn't all that dynamic. We found that the always-on display is maybe a little too on. The battery life, well, it's no better, even a little worse than the previous iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max. And of course, the cameras, well, they look amazing unless they're completely fucked. So it's actually very difficult to draw a conclusion on these phones because each of these features I personally like, and I think this is a big upgrade if you ignore all of those drawbacks. But you can't, and I'm kind of nervous that my camera's gonna get wonky at any given moment. So for now, the answer really is time. Apple needs to fix some of these issues, and until all of those things happen, it's kind of difficult for me to recommend the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max. It's kind of unexpected. That doesn't usually happen, but that's where we are. Thank you guys so much for watching.